Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are stepping into the skies of the 1970s, a decade that carried both the excitement of modern air travel and the hidden shadows of fear. Many people remember the name D.B. Cooper, the mysterious man who boarded a flight in the United States, demanded a ransom, and then disappeared into the night sky. But what if I told you that Europe, too, had its own stories of men who mirrored Cooper's boldness, vanishing into history with little more than a suitcase and a threat? The 1970s were a fascinating period for aviation. Air travel was becoming more accessible to the public, a symbol of freedom and progress. Families could cross borders in hours, business executives could attend meetings in distant capitals, and students could chase dreams beyond their homelands. Yet beneath this golden image of convenience and discovery lay a growing concern. Airline security was far from what we know today. Metal detectors were not yet common in every airport, baggage checks were less strict, and crew members were trained more for hospitality than crisis management. This environment created opportunities for those bold enough to exploit the gaps. In Europe, scattered reports began to emerge of men who stepped onto airplanes with hidden intentions. Some carried handwritten notes claiming they had explosives. Others simply demanded money, threatening chaos if their conditions were not met. Passengers often sat in fearful silence, unaware if the threats were real or a bluff. And remarkably, in more than a few cases, these hijackers managed to secure their ransom and vanish without being caught. Unlike the United States, where the D.B. Cooper story became an enduring legend, European cases did not always make headlines across the globe. But that does not mean they were less mysterious. On the contrary, the lack of widespread coverage left even more unanswered questions. Who were these men? Where did they disappear to? And why have their names been buried in old files, overshadowed by Cooper's fame? One of these figures, whispered about in certain reports, is Pierre Paul Thomas, a man sometimes described as the European D.B. Cooper. The details of his story remain hazy. And that haziness is exactly what draws us in. In the quiet corridors of aviation history, his name floats like a ghost, a reminder that the skies of Europe once carried their own unsolved puzzles. As we journey through this story, we won't just revisit the events themselves. We will also explore the era that made such acts possible. An age of trust mixed with naivety, where the romance of air travel met the harsh reality of human ambition. This is not just about one man, but about a climate of mystery that stretched across continents. So buckle in as we take off into today's episode. We will retrace the atmosphere of 1970s Europe, uncover what little we know about Pierre Paul Thomas, and connect the dots between him and the man America still cannot forget, D.B. Cooper. The question we will keep asking is simple: was Europe also home to its own Cooper? A figure who stepped into an airplane and vanished into legend. When we think of mysterious aviation crimes, D.B. Cooper almost always comes first to mind. On that rainy evening in November 1971, he boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon, with nothing more than a briefcase and a plan. After calmly handing a note to a flight attendant claiming he carried a bomb, he demanded $200,000 in cash and several parachutes. The passengers were released unharmed, but as the plane flew into the dark night, Cooper jumped from the rear stairs with the ransom strapped to his body, never to be seen again. His daring escape and subsequent disappearance left law enforcement baffled and created a legend that still captures the imagination today. But across the Atlantic, Europeans were watching. And in the years that followed, echoes of Cooper's bold crime could be felt in several hijackings. These were not simple copycat acts, nor were they always executed with the same flair. Yet the core of the story was eerily familiar: a man steps onto a plane, issues demands for money or safe passage, and then somehow vanishes without the authorities ever catching him. Why did these echoes appear in Europe? The answer lies in the global mood of the 1970s. Air travel had become a modern marvel, but security protocols were still in their infancy. Boarding a flight often meant walking straight from the terminal onto the plane with little scrutiny. That atmosphere of trust was both charming and dangerous. It allowed countless innocent travelers to fly freely, but it also opened the door for individuals with darker intentions. In the United States, D.B. Cooper became a household name because the FBI invested enormous resources into solving his case, making it front-page news for years. In Europe, however, the situation was more fragmented. Hijackings were sometimes hushed up, treated as isolated incidents, or even overshadowed by political crises of the Cold War era. As a result, while Cooper was becoming a cultural icon in America, the European counterparts remained more obscure, their names and deeds slipping into the shadows. Still, the parallels are undeniable. Like Cooper, these men seemed to vanish into thin air. Ransoms were collected, threats were issued, and in the aftermath investigators were left with questions instead of answers. Some reports even describe hijackers parachuting into the night, just as Cooper had done. The idea of a man stepping off an airplane mid-flight might sound cinematic. But in the 1970s it was not beyond possibility. The enduring fascination lies in what we do not know. Was Europe's D.B. Cooper inspired directly by the American case, or did the climate of the time simply make such actions seem feasible to desperate men in search of money or freedom? These echoes remind us that Cooper was not a lone figure in aviation history. He was part of a broader story, one that spanned oceans and touched nations struggling to adapt to a new age of global air travel. As we move deeper into this journey, we will look more closely at how these European cases unfolded, and how names like Pierre Paul Thomas entered the lore of aviation mysteries. The similarities to D.B. Cooper are striking, but the differences are just as revealing. Now let us turn our focus to one of the names that occasionally surfaces in aviation folklore, Pierre Paul Thomas. Unlike D.B. Cooper, whose story has been dissected in books, documentaries, and endless debates, Thomas remains almost ghost-like, a name whispered in fragments, appearing in scattered accounts, but never fully illuminated. And that is exactly what makes him so intriguing. According to some reports, Thomas operated in Europe during the 1970s, at the height of aviation's most vulnerable decade. The details vary depending on the source, but the general outline feels familiar to anyone who has studied Cooper's case. A man boards a commercial airliner. He carries either a suitcase or a note claiming to hold explosives. He demands money or a specific route for the aircraft. And then, through methods still unclear, he disappears, leaving investigators without a trace. What sets Pierre Paul Thomas apart is the mystery of his identity. Unlike Cooper, who left behind a handful of physical evidence like a black tie, cigarette butts, and the ransom bills, Thomas left virtually nothing. It is as if he existed only in the moment of the crime itself, a shadow that slipped between the cracks of Europe's aviation history. For researchers and enthusiasts, this absence of detail has turned him into a kind of legend, a symbol of unanswered questions rather than a man with a known backstory. Why, then, does his name persist at all? The answer may lie in the parallels to D.B. Cooper. Cooper's case was so shocking, so sensational, that any similar story, especially one in Europe, would inevitably be linked to him. Thomas became shorthand for the idea that Europe had its own version of Cooper, a figure who demonstrated both the daring and the audacity to challenge the system and then vanish. But here is where things become even more fascinating. While Cooper's case was widely publicized in the United States, European authorities often preferred silence. During the Cold War era, governments worried that too much publicity around hijackings could inspire others to attempt the same. As a result, cases like Thomas's may have been deliberately downplayed. This silence has only deepened the mystery, ensuring that his story exists today more as rumor and legend than as an official record. What we do know is that aviation historians have traced mentions of him in connection with ransom-style hijackings. The fact that his name lingers in discussions of unsolved air crimes suggests that something significant did occur even if the official files remain locked away or forgotten. Like Cooper, Thomas represents more than just a man. He embodies an era of uncertainty, when the freedom of flight was shadowed by the fear of those who would exploit it. As we continue, we will explore the methods these hijackers used, the loopholes in European security at the time, and why figures like Thomas could step into an airport with little more than confidence and a plan. His story may be incomplete, but sometimes the absence of detail is what makes a mystery last forever. To understand why figures like Pierre Paul Thomas or even D.B. Cooper captured the imagination of the public, we need to look more closely at the core of their actions: the ransom demand. For many hijackers of the 1970s, money was not just a motive, it was the script. The process was simple in theory but terrifying in execution. Step onto a plane, gain control of the situation with a weapon or even just the claim of a bomb, and then demand cash in exchange for the safety of passengers. In today's world of advanced airport scanners, secure cockpit doors, and highly trained security teams, this sounds almost impossible. But in the 1970s, the environment was entirely different. Most flights operated with minimal security checks. Passengers could carry items aboard that would never pass through today's systems. Flight attendants and pilots, trained to maintain calm and avoid panic, were often forced into compliance once a hijacker revealed his intentions. The ransom requests varied. Some were modest thousands of dollars, enough to disappear and start over somewhere far away. Others were bold, reaching into the hundreds of thousands, even millions, depending on the scale of the operation. In Cooper's case, $200,000 was considered a staggering amount at the time, equivalent to over $1 million today. In Europe, the sums demanded by hijackers were sometimes smaller, reflecting both the limitations of local airlines and the lower profile of the cases. Still, the impact was the same: chaos in the skies, headlines on the ground, and investigators left scrambling. What made these ransom demands particularly chilling was the uncertainty. Passengers and crew never knew whether the hijackers' threats were real or a bluff. A suitcase might contain nothing more than wires and batteries, but to those sitting only a few feet away, it could feel like a ticking bomb. That psychological edge gave hijackers enormous power. In many cases, airlines and governments chose to pay rather than risk lives. And then came the most dramatic twist: the escape. Once money was secured, some hijackers demanded to be flown to a specific country, often one outside the reach of Western authorities. Others insisted the plane land so they could slip away, blending into the chaos of the airport. A few, like Cooper, allegedly parachuted into the night, vanishing into history with both cash and mystery intact. For European authorities, these ransom hijackings posed a major dilemma. To pay meant encouraging future crimes, but to refuse risked the lives of innocent passengers. This tension defined much of the era and forced governments to rethink aviation security entirely. It was in this climate that names like Pierre Paul Thomas emerged, a man who allegedly played the ransom game and won, if only for a short time, by disappearing without a trace. The ransom demand was never just about money. It was about control, fear, and the audacity to bend a system to one's will. It is this audacity that continues to fascinate us, decades later. One of the most astonishing aspects of these hijackings is not simply that they occurred, but that so many of the perpetrators managed to escape without leaving behind solid evidence. In today's world of surveillance cameras, biometric data, and digital records, the idea of someone vanishing after committing such a bold crime feels almost unthinkable. But in the 1970s, the gaps in technology and procedure created opportunities that determined hijackers could exploit. When D.B. Cooper jumped into the stormy night with his ransom strapped to his chest, investigators at least had fragments to study: a tie, cigarette butts, witness sketches, and even some ransom bills that turned up years later. But in Europe, cases like Pierre Paul Thomas's left far less to work with. Often, once the hijacker was gone, authorities found themselves staring at an empty seat and a string of unanswered questions. How was this possible? Part of the answer lies in the sheer lack of documentation. Passengers were not always required to show identification the way they are today. In some countries, a ticket and cash payment were enough to secure a seat. This meant a hijacker could use an alias, vanish after the crime, and leave no official trail linking his real identity to the event. Then there were the aircraft themselves. Airplanes of the 1970s lacked the security systems we now take for granted. There were no high-definition cameras watching each row. No advanced tracking devices monitoring passenger movements. And certainly no biometric checks when boarding. If a hijacker escaped mid-flight or blended into the crowd after landing, the only clues were the frightened testimonies of crew and passengers. Even forensic science of the era had its limitations. Fingerprint collection was inconsistent, and DNA analysis was decades away from being a useful investigative tool. If a hijacker wore gloves or handled only a few surfaces, investigators might have had nothing tangible to trace. In this environment, vanishing was not only possible, it was almost expected if the plan was executed carefully. The success of such escapes left authorities deeply unsettled. How could men demand ransoms, terrorize passengers, and then walk away untouched? Some believe these hijackers must have had help either from accomplices waiting on the ground or, more controversially, from insiders within the aviation system itself. Others suggested that Cold War politics may have played a role, with certain governments turning a blind eye if the hijackers' actions aligned with broader political agendas. What remains most striking is the silence afterward. Unlike today, when media outlets chase every lead and public databases preserve stories for decades, many of these European hijackings slipped quietly into history. Reports were filed, but without answers, the cases often faded from public attention. All that was left were names like Pierre Paul Thomas, half legend, half shadow, representing the men who seemed to step into the air and never return. It is this ability to vanish, to erase themselves from the scene, that transformed hijackers of the 1970s into enduring mysteries. They were not just criminals. They became phantoms, haunting aviation history long after the trails had gone cold. To truly understand how hijackers like Pierre Paul Thomas could vanish without a trace, we need to step back and examine the world of air travel in the 1970s. Airport security in Europe during that era was strikingly loose by modern standards, and this lax environment created the perfect stage for bold crimes. At that time, air travel still carried a sense of glamour and trust. Flying was an exciting experience, often associated with luxury, convenience, and the thrill of crossing borders in hours instead of days. The idea of criminal threats in the skies seemed distant, even improbable, to the general public. As a result, governments and airlines had not yet built the strict layers of defense we consider essential today. For example, many European airports had no universal requirement for metal detectors at boarding gates until the mid to late 1970s. Even when detectors were installed, enforcement could be inconsistent. Carry-on luggage was rarely screened with the rigor we know today. X-ray machines existed, but they were not standard across all airports, and staff were not always trained to spot hidden threats. This meant that small firearms, knives, or even dummy explosives could slip past security with relative ease. Identification checks were also minimal. In several European countries, passengers could purchase tickets with cash and board a plane without presenting a formal ID. This anonymity gave hijackers enormous freedom. If they managed to escape after an incident, authorities often had no reliable way to connect the name on the ticket with the real identity of the suspect. The cockpit itself was another vulnerability. In those days, the doors separating passengers from pilots were often left unlocked, or at best secured with simple latches. Hijackers could gain access to the flight crew more easily than one might imagine. Today's reinforced, bulletproof cockpit doors were a direct response to decades of such incidents, but in the 1970s, the idea of fortifying that barrier had not yet taken hold. Another factor was the training of airline staff. Flight attendants were primarily instructed to focus on passenger comfort and service, not on confronting dangerous situations. When faced with a hijacker's demands, their first instinct understandably was to keep passengers calm and cooperate. This tendency often made it easier for hijackers to maintain control without immediate resistance. Finally, we must remember the political climate. Europe in the 1970s was shaped by Cold War tensions, domestic unrest, and movements that sometimes resorted to dramatic actions, including hijackings, to draw attention to their causes. Authorities were stretched thin and often chose negotiation over confrontation to avoid tragic outcomes. This environment only emboldened those willing to test the system. When we combine all of these weaknesses, minimal screening, poor identification protocols, accessible cockpits, and an atmosphere of trust, we see why hijackers could step onto planes with little more than confidence and a plan. For men like Pierre Paul Thomas, the vulnerabilities of European airports made the impossible seem possible. In hindsight, these gaps may seem shocking, but they also help explain why the 1970s became one of the most turbulent decades in aviation security history. It was a time when bold individuals could take advantage of trust and vanish into legend. If airport security in Europe during the 1970s was already fragile, the vulnerabilities became even more pronounced once passengers were inside the aircraft. In that era, jumping from planes or smuggling small weapons aboard was not only possible, but in some cases, shockingly simple. Let us start with the idea of jumping from an airplane mid-flight. At first glance, this sounds like something out of a Hollywood thriller, dramatic, reckless, and nearly impossible. But the reality is that aircraft design at the time sometimes made such actions feasible. Many planes in the 1960s and 70s were equipped with rear staircases that could be lowered even in flight, just as D.B. Cooper famously used. These stairways were meant for quick ground loading, but hijackers recognized the hidden opportunity. They offered a literal escape hatch. Though incredibly dangerous, the act of parachuting from a passenger jet was not beyond imagination for determined individuals. Some reports from Europe suggest hijackers took advantage of similar exits, disappearing into the night just as Cooper had done in the United States. While investigators often questioned whether such a stunt was survivable, the fact remains: no body, no trace, no captured suspect. That silence was sometimes enough to fuel the myth of the successful escape. Then there was the issue of weapons. Smuggling a firearm, knife, or even a fake explosive device on board was far easier than we would expect today. With no consistent use of X-ray scanners or explosive detectors, Small objects could slip through unchecked. Even a realistic-looking prop could create fear powerful enough to control an entire cabin. A handwritten note combined with a mysterious briefcase was often sufficient to convince flight crews of a hijacker's seriousness. In several European incidents, investigators later discovered that the bomb shown to passengers was nothing more than wires, batteries, and clay or putty designed to look like explosives. Yet in the tense atmosphere of a hijacking, no one was willing to take the risk of calling a bluff. Airlines, under immense pressure to protect lives, frequently complied with demands rather than gamble on exposing a fake. The accessibility of weapons and the possibility of escape by parachute created a chilling combination. Hijackers did not need sophisticated technology or military training, just nerve, planning, and a willingness to take extraordinary risks. It was a formula that allowed ordinary-looking individuals to bend powerful institutions to their will, at least temporarily. What stands out most today is how thin the line was between fear and control. A single object hidden in a suitcase, or the mere suggestion of an exit strategy, could paralyze an entire flight. And because security systems and investigative tools were so limited, once the hijacker vanished, there was often little that authorities could do to track them down afterward. For men like Pierre Paul Thomas, these weaknesses meant opportunity. He could smuggle a weapon or threaten with a decoy, demand money, and then vanish into the night, leaving nothing but questions behind. It was the perfect storm of daring and circumstance, one that would shape aviation policy for decades to come. Perhaps the most haunting detail of these European hijackings is that several suspects simply vanished, never to be identified, arrested, or even conclusively tracked. In the world of criminal investigation, this kind of disappearance is rare. Even the most carefully planned crimes usually leave some trail. A fingerprint, a witness, or a fragment of physical evidence. Yet in the skies of 1970s Europe, hijackers sometimes dissolved into thin air, as if the clouds themselves swallowed them whole. Consider what this meant for investigators at the time. After a hijacking ended, authorities often had little to work with beyond vague descriptions from frightened passengers. A man in his 30s, wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, details that could match hundreds of travelers on any given day. Without ID checks at airports or thorough record keeping, these descriptions often led nowhere. In some cases, hijackers parachuted from planes and disappeared into rural landscapes. If they survived the dangerous jumps, they could easily have been picked up by accomplices waiting on the ground. From there, slipping across a border in Cold War-era Europe was not as difficult as it sounds. Many countries had porous boundaries, and movements of small groups or individuals often went unnoticed. Other hijackers vanished through the chaos of airports themselves. Imagine a plane landing under tense circumstances, police and negotiators scrambling on the tarmac, and passengers being evacuated. In that confusion, a determined hijacker, especially one who had already discarded incriminating items, could potentially merge with the crowd and escape before authorities realized what had happened. This pattern of vanishing suspects raised troubling questions for European governments. Were these men operating alone, or were they part of broader networks? Did certain states quietly shelter them, seeing political advantage in protecting figures who embarrassed rival nations, or were they simply individuals clever enough to exploit loopholes in a system not yet designed to stop them? For the public, these disappearances were both frightening and strangely captivating. The idea that a hijacker could outwit entire police forces and intelligence agencies turned these figures into modern-day phantoms. Just as D.B. Cooper became a legend in America precisely because he was never found, Europe's unidentified hijackers gained a similar aura. Their names, when remembered at all, like Pierre Paul Thomas, carried a weight of mystery precisely because so little else was known. What makes this even more remarkable is the silence that often followed. Unlike Cooper's case, which stayed alive in headlines for decades, many European hijackings quickly faded from the news cycle once immediate danger had passed. Without a trial, a confession, or even a confirmed identity, the stories simply drifted into obscurity. Only fragments remained: scattered newspaper clippings, mentions in aviation archives, or whispers among enthusiasts who refused to let the mysteries die. These vanished suspects remind us that history is not always neatly written. Sometimes, it is full of holes, gaps where people step in and out, leaving no footprints behind. And it is in those gaps that legends are born, legends that continue to haunt the skies long after the planes have landed. Whenever a mystery endures, theories inevitably emerge to fill the silence. In the case of Europe's missing hijackers, men like the elusive Pierre Paul Thomas, three major explanations have dominated discussions: parachute escapes, accomplice support, and political cover-ups. Each of these theories paints a different picture of how such bold crimes could have been carried out without leaving a trace. The first theory is perhaps the most cinematic: parachute escapes. Inspired by D.B. Cooper's infamous jump in the United States, some European hijackers may have attempted similar feats. Aircraft of the era, with their rear stairways and less secure exits, made such stunts technically possible. Though the risks were enormous: high winds, freezing temperatures, uncertain landing zones. The fact that no bodies were found afterward kept speculation alive. Survivors of these leaps could have disappeared into forests, mountains, or rural farmlands, their tracks quickly erased by weather or time. The lack of evidence only added fuel to the legend. The second theory revolves around accomplice support. A lone man jumping from a jetliner might seem reckless, but what if he was not acting alone? Some researchers believe these hijackers had partners waiting on the ground. Vehicles positioned near predicted flight paths, safe houses prepared in advance, or even contacts within airports could have smoothed their escapes. In this view, the hijacker was just the visible tip of a larger operation, supported by a network determined to keep him hidden. This idea gains credibility when we consider how quickly some suspects vanished after landing, too quickly, perhaps, for coincidence alone. The third, and most controversial, theory is political cover-ups. Europe in the 1970s was a continent divided by ideology, caught in the long shadow of the Cold War. Hijackings were not always motivated purely by money. Sometimes, they intersected with political agendas. Could certain governments have quietly allowed hijackers to disappear if their actions embarrassed rival nations? Could intelligence agencies have manipulated the outcomes, burying details that might have revealed uncomfortable truths? While direct proof is scarce, the political context of the time makes such questions difficult to dismiss entirely. Each of these theories shares one thing in common: they acknowledge the gaps left by official investigations. When records are incomplete, when suspects vanish, and when stories fade from headlines, speculation becomes the only way to bridge the void. The truth may lie in a combination of these possibilities. Perhaps one hijacker did leap successfully into the night. Perhaps another was whisked away by accomplices, never to resurface. And perhaps, in at least a few cases, the silence of governments was deliberate rather than accidental. For the public, these theories are not just explanations, they are the lifeblood of the mystery. They keep the stories alive, sparking debates in cafes, classrooms, and internet forums decades later. Whether through parachutes, partners, or politics, the unanswered question remains the same. How could ordinary men turn an airplane into a stage for one of history's greatest disappearing acts? As we step back from the individual cases, it becomes clear that these hijackings, whether successful or not, expose the deep vulnerabilities of 1970s civil aviation. The skies, once considered symbols of freedom and progress, suddenly looked fragile. Every incident revealed cracks in the system that governments, airlines, and passengers could no longer ignore. First, there was the issue of trust. Commercial air travel in the 1970s still carried an aura of innocence. Airports were designed to welcome travelers, not to screen them as potential threats. Families waved goodbye at the gates, friends boarded planes with minimal checks. And ticket purchases were often as simple as paying cash. This openness, while charming, created an environment where individuals with malicious intent could blend in effortlessly. Second, the hijackings highlighted weaknesses in preparedness. Flight crews were trained to manage comfort and emergencies like turbulence or medical issues, not armed threats in the cabin. When confronted by a hijacker, their instructions were clear: comply, de-escalate, and prioritize passenger safety. While this approach often prevented immediate tragedy, it also empowered hijackers, who learned that demands would usually be met rather than resisted. Third, the incidents underscored the lack of technological safeguards. There were no reinforced cockpit doors, no advanced scanning equipment, and no onboard surveillance systems. A hijacker with nothing more than a convincing bluff could gain the upper hand. Once in control, the hijacker dictated terms: where to fly, when to land, how to negotiate, and authorities on the ground were left scrambling to respond. These vulnerabilities also extended to the legal and political systems. Countries across Europe had no unified protocol for handling hijackings. Each incident became a test of negotiation strategies, often decided in real time with lives at stake. Some governments chose to pay ransoms quickly to end the ordeal. Others tried to resist but risked escalation. The inconsistency revealed just how unprepared civil aviation was for coordinated criminal threats. Public perception also shifted. Passengers began to realize that stepping onto an airplane was not as safe as they once believed. The romantic image of air travel, filled with glamour and excitement, was slowly replaced by a new awareness of its dangers. Newspapers ran headlines about hijackings with alarming frequency, and fear began to creep into what had once been routine journeys. For investigators, the disappearing hijackers were the final insult. Not only had security failed to prevent the crimes, but law enforcement also failed to capture the culprits afterward. Each unsolved case became a reminder that the system was lagging behind those bold enough to exploit it. In many ways, these vulnerabilities became the catalyst for change. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, governments began investing in stronger security measures, international cooperation, and better training for aviation staff. But the lessons were learned at a cost, and names like Pierre Paul Thomas became symbols of what could slip through the cracks when civil aviation was still finding its footing in a dangerous new world. While D.B. Cooper became a household name and a lasting pop culture icon, the European cases never reached the same level of global fame. And this difference reveals a lot about how stories are told, remembered, and mythologized. In the United States, Cooper's daring heist was immediately sensationalized by the media. His case was not just about crime, it became a mystery, a puzzle, and eventually, a legend. News networks covered every detail, from the ransom bills to the FBI's search in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Over time, Cooper became more than a man. He became a symbol of clever rebellion against authority, the mysterious stranger who vanished into thin air. Songs were written about him, novels used his name, and documentaries returned to the story again and again. Europe's hijackers, however, did not receive the same treatment. Their stories were often confined to local or regional coverage. Once the immediate danger had passed and passengers were safe, the headlines faded quickly. Unlike in the United States, where the FBI's long and public investigation kept Cooper's name alive, European authorities often moved to suppress publicity. Many governments feared that glorifying hijackers would inspire copycats. In some countries, officials deliberately downplayed incidents to project an image of control and stability. The result is that names like Pierre Paul Thomas never became widely known outside specialist circles. Without books, songs, or repeated documentaries, his story remained obscure. Even within Europe, these cases are not commonly remembered today. For the public, they were passing dramas alarming in the moment, but soon replaced by other crises in a turbulent decade filled with political unrest, terrorism, and Cold War tension. There was also a cultural difference. In America, the outlaw archetype has long held a strange allure from Wild West bandits to Prohibition-era gangsters. D.B. Cooper fit neatly into that narrative, a mysterious rebel defying the system. Europe, on the other hand, had a more complicated relationship with such figures. Hijackers were often seen not as folk heroes but as threats tied to political extremism or instability. Their actions did not inspire admiration so much as fear and frustration. Still, the lack of global fame does not make the European cases any less fascinating. In some ways, their obscurity deepens the mystery. Without endless retellings and cultural reinvention, the stories remain raw and unsettling. With fewer layers of myth to separate us from the events themselves. We do not have a polished legend, we have shadows, fragments, and unanswered questions. It is ironic, D.B. Cooper is remembered worldwide, though we still do not know who he was or what became of him. Meanwhile, figures like Pierre Paul Thomas actually succeeded in vanishing just as completely, but without the world ever noticing. Perhaps their anonymity is its own form of victory. They remain untold stories, hidden in the margins of history, waiting for curious minds to rediscover them. In the end, fame or obscurity does not change the impact of these events. What matters is what they revealed, that aviation was vulnerable. That mysteries could unfold at 30,000 feet, and that sometimes the most dramatic stories are the ones we forget to tell. When we place these stories against the larger backdrop of history, it becomes clear that figures like Pierre Paul Thomas are more than just forgotten hijackers, they are symbols of Cold War-era aviation mysteries. They represent a time when the skies were both open and vulnerable. When travel connected continents but also exposed societies to new forms of risk. The Cold War was not only a battle of ideologies. It was also an age of secrecy, espionage, and blurred loyalties. Every unexplained event carried with it the possibility of hidden agendas. A man vanishing from an airplane was not just a crime, it raised questions about whether intelligence agencies, underground networks, or even governments had a hand in what happened. Was the hijacker simply a lone outlaw, or was he a pawn in a larger game of political theater? This uncertainty is what gives Thomas and others like him their symbolic power. They embody the anxieties of the era, fear of instability, mistrust of institutions, and the sense that anyone, anywhere, could disrupt the fragile balance of order. To board a plane in the 1970s was to embrace progress and modernity, but also to risk being caught in the crosscurrents of a world that was changing too quickly for its own safety systems to keep up. Over time, the stories of these vanished hijackers became folded into the folklore of the Cold War. They are not as well known as espionage scandals or high-profile defections, but they belong to the same atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue. Just as spies moved invisibly across borders, Hijackers like Thomas seemed to move invisibly through the skies, appearing suddenly, making demands, and then disappearing into history. In this way, Thomas is less a fully documented figure and more a mythical construct. He represents the unknown hijacker, the man who could be anyone and yet is remembered as no one. His name survives because it captures the essence of the mystery, the idea that Europe, too, had its own D.B. Cooper, a man who stepped aboard a plane, disrupted the order of things, and then left behind nothing but questions. Even today, these stories remind us of how fragile security once was, and how much trust was placed in a system that could be so easily broken. They also remind us that not every mystery gets solved, and not every criminal gets caught. Sometimes, history leaves gaps on purpose, gaps that become legends, whispered across decades. For aviation historians, Pierre Paul Thomas is a marker of what went wrong in the 1970s, but also of how those failures shaped the changes that followed. For the public, he is a ghost of the skies, part of a forgotten chapter that still has the power to fascinate. And for us, he is a reminder that in the Cold War era, the line between reality and myth was often thin, and the people who crossed it became timeless symbols of uncertainty. As we come to the end of this journey, let us take a step back and reflect on what these stories truly mean. The tale of D.B. Cooper is famous worldwide, but the echoes we have explored in Europe remind us that he was not alone in shaping the mysteries of aviation history. Figures like Pierre Paul Thomas and the many unnamed hijackers of the 1970s may not have achieved the same cultural immortality, but their impact was just as significant. They revealed how fragile civil aviation once was, how quickly trust could be exploited, and how the open skies of the Cold War era were both symbols of freedom and stages for risk. These men were not heroes. They were opportunists, gamblers, and perhaps, in some cases, political actors hidden within larger conflicts. But by vanishing without a trace, they became more than criminals. They became legends of uncertainty, reminders that not all questions can be answered, and that some mysteries will always drift just beyond our reach. What keeps us fascinated is not only the crimes themselves, but the silence that followed. No fingerprints, no confirmed identities, no captured suspects. Just unanswered questions, fragments of reports, and a handful of names that may or may not even tell the whole truth. In that silence, our imagination takes over, and the legend grows. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Pierre Paul Thomas and his peers. They remind us that history is not always neat. It is filled with gaps, shadows, and stories that refuse to be tied up with clear endings. They are the ghosts of an era when the world was more vulnerable, when mysteries could unfold at 30,000 feet, and when even the most ordinary-looking man could step onto a plane and become unforgettable. As we close today's episode, I would like to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of aviation's lesser-known mysteries. If you found this story intriguing, make sure to leave a comment below. Do you believe Pierre Paul Thomas was real, or just a name created to echo D.B. Cooper's legend? Could he have survived his escape, or was he another figure swallowed by history? I would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration into history's greatest mysteries. Until then, keep your curiosity alive, and remember, sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones that do not have an ending. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.